There is no easy answer on the correct amount of removal to run in EDH. I've seen templates that advocate running a certain amount of both spot removal as well as board wipes, but I think with removal, just like with each and every card you run, the question you should be asking is, how does this specific card fit into my overall strategy? For example, is there someone in your playgroup that runs an annoying combo that you hate losing to? In that situation, you would want to decide on your plan for dealing with that player. You could choose a more aggro strategy, and even go so far as to actually take removal out of your deck and try to remove the player before they can combo off. Or you could try running enough removal to reliably get rid of those combo pieces. But the right amount will depend on how soon that combo comes down. If it's coming down in the first 8 turns of the game, you probably want something like 12 pieces of removal. But that also depends on how many cards you draw, how you mulligan, and whether or not you run tutors. Of course, there are probably 2 other players in the game who should also be able to help deal with that player before they combo off. In fact, if you know for certain your opponents will deal with that player's combo, then it's always to your advantage to not deal with that threat yourself, because that means your opponents spent their removal on one of your other opponents, and it also means you get to sit on your removal to use later. As an aside, that's why it's so important to understand how priority works. If you know how to sit on your removal until the last possible moment you can play it, you put pressure on your opponents to use their removal instead. Now, it's important to remember that whatever path you choose still needs to fit within your overall strategy for the game. So, for example, if you're running an aggro deck and you want to run removal, how are you going to run that removal without taking away from your aggro strategy? If you run removal like Lightning Bolt or Rakdos Charm, then these have the advantage that they can also be used to deal damage directly to a player. But if you run removal like Swords to Plowshares or Beast Within, then these are spells which run against your aggro strategy because Swords to Plowshares gives your opponent life and Beast Within gives them a blocker. And even in the case of running something like Lightning Bolt, if you use that as a removal spell instead of using it to deal damage, this can put you behind on your strategy of killing your opponent. This is because aggro decks don't have the card draw and resource advantage other decks have, and so their cards need to be focused on taking their opponents out. In other words, if you start playing your aggro deck like a mid-range or control deck, you're most likely going to run out of cards since you don't have the card draw that a mid-range or control deck has. This is also true of building the deck. If you start adding in too many cards like Murder or Counterspell in a deck which is otherwise supposed to have an aggro strategy, you're probably going to find yourself running out of the aggro cards you need to actually run your opponents over. This is why people will tell you to add in card draw, but at a certain point, if you add in too much removal and card draw, you'll be spending your turns, casting your removal, and refilling your hands instead of running your opponents over. At that point, you may no longer even be playing an aggro deck. And all of that is perfectly fine. Decks can evolve over time and turn into a different type of deck, but you need to be aware of what you're doing or it'll be difficult to make cuts to your deck, mulligan, and actually play the deck. Ultimately, I feel there's an attitude that running spot removal and board wipes is an obligation people have, because removing problematic permanents and wiping the board helps prevent out-of-control board states. However, in a sufficiently aggressive deck, even the threat of lethal damage can prevent those out-of-control board states. For example, with my Yoshimaru Kodama deck, I can often threaten one player with lethal commander damage from Yoshimaru in the first 5 turns of the game. That lethal dog damage is typically going to be sent towards the player who I know is trying to set themselves up for an out-of-control board state, such as the Simic player. And by swinging my commander at that Simic player who is trying to set themselves up for some very busted turns, I can force that player onto their back foot and put them in a position where they have to slow down. Best case scenario, that could mean on turn 3, instead of casting Kodama's Reach, they sit on their mana to bounce Yoshimaru with Cyclonic Rift. In this ideal situation, not only does that player not get to cast their ramp to move ahead on lands, but it also means they cast their Cyclonic Rift at a very inopportune time. It could also be the case the player takes that early damage in order to ramp into their commander, but that can just mean that when Yoshimaru swings at them on turn 4 or 5, they're forced to block with and lose their commander so they don't die to lethal damage. It's worth noting that even if Yoshimaru is only a 6/6 and will trade with their commander, it's still to my advantage to take that trade, because I'll be able to replay Yoshimaru for 3 mana, whereas they'll have to wait 2 turns to hopefully get enough mana to recast their commander for 8 mana. Now, it's true I could add more spot removal and board wipes into Yoshimaru and do things like cast Wrath of God or Beast Within instead, but I might not have enough card draw to refill my hand after casting too many of those removal spells, and I don't really want to wipe my own board. Also, if I cast removal spells, then I'm spending mana on cards which could have been spent on advancing my own board instead. That isn't to say I run no removal in the deck, but the removal I do run fits into the rest of what the deck is doing. For example, I have 3 planeswalkers which can remove creatures, and they're legendary, so they buff Yoshimaru when they come into play, and additionally I do have some cards which synergize with planeswalker loyalty counters. I also have Urza's Ruinous Blast because the deck is legendary tribal, so it won't hit my own permanents. And lastly, I run Swords to Plowshares because it is very mana efficient and the deck has a Japanese theme, so I want an excuse to run the special Strixhaven art of the card. If I were to add in more removal, I could adjust the deck to accommodate that. For example, I could add in Mithril Coat to protect Yoshimaru from wrath effects that would also kill him, and I could add in more card draw to help with the card disadvantage I create for myself. But that's a different deck which would come with different lines of play. For example, if I were to plan to wipe the board on turn 4, I'm probably not going to want to play my commander turn 1, and I probably also wouldn't want to run a lot of the other creatures that come down turn 2 or 3. There could also be a situation where I play in a group that runs a card like Humility, and because I don't want to lose that card, I add in Beast Within and Generous Gift. I don't have to add those in. I could also just accept that as a creature-based deck, if Humility comes down, I'm just going to sit there and do nothing until one of my opponents deals with it or I lose the game. Both approaches are valid, and I personally choose to run a deck which doesn't have good options against a card like Humility. It's also the case you can run 0 removal. My K&T deck chooses to accelerate my opponents and then use goad cards as well as mass steal effects like Insurrection to turn those creatures against my opponents. Well, it's true it's a control deck, and normally you'd want removal and especially board wipes in a control deck. I instead choose to leave my opponent's creatures in play because destroying them would take away from my larger strategy of using those creatures against them. I will say that in theory, it would always be better to have more removal, assuming that the removal you run doesn't take away from what the rest of your deck is doing. But the problem is adding in more removal always comes at a cost. You can try to minimize the cost by keeping the cards on theme. For example, in my Giada Angel Waifu deck, I run every single removal card which is also an angel, and if Wizards ever prints more, I'll add those in too. And the same is true for my Yoshimaru Kodama deck. If I could add in more legendary cards which also worked as good removal, I would be happy to do that. But because more of those cards don't exist yet, I prefer to stay more on theme with my decks, even if that means I don't always have an answer for everything. So all that is to say, you don't always have to think about removal as something that every deck needs a certain amount of. Instead, you can think about your removal in terms of lines of play and what removal will be best for your deck. Ultimately, if you need help figuring out what the best removal for your deck is, I actually have a video about that I'll link to at the end of this.